Introduction. The place of Volume 2 in Marx's general analysis of capitalism. The second volume is purely scientific, only dealing with questions from one bourgeois to another, wrote Frederick Engels to the Russian populist, Lavrov, on the 5th of February 1884. 17 months later, he told Sorge, the second volume will provoke great disappointment, because it is purely scientific and does not contain much material for agitation. Finally, on the 13th of November 1885, he wrote to Danielson, I had no doubt that the second volume would afford you the same pleasure as it has done to me. The developments it contains are indeed of such superior order that the vulgar reader will not take the trouble to fathom them and to follow them out. This is actually the case in Germany, where all historical science, including political economy, has fallen so low that it can scarcely fall any lower. Our Kathetersozialisten have never been much more, theoretically, than slightly philanthropic Vulgärökonomen, and now they have sunk to the level of simple apologists of Bismarck's Staatssozialismus. To them, the second volume will always remain a sealed book. Official economic literature observes a cautious silence with regard to it. These predictions were to be verified far beyond Engels's fears. In fact, 10 years passed before two young Russian Marxists, Tugan Baranowski followed by S. Bulgakov, made the first application of the main conceptual innovations of Volume 2. And it took nearly another decade for these concepts finally to penetrate Germany and the Western world, through an international debate in which Tugan Baranowski, albeit won. Engels to Lavrov. Marx-Engels work, Volume 36, page 99. Engels to Sorge, Ibid. pp. 296 and 324. Engels to Danielson, Ibid. pp. 298 and 384. See also Marx, Engels, Selected Correspondence, Moscow, 1975, pp. 365-6. For Kathetersozialisten, etc., see notes ONPP. 88 and 101 below. 12. Introduction. For the moment continuing to call himself a Marxist. Began to revise some of Marx's key theories. 2. Volume 2 of Capital has indeed been not only a sealed book, but also a forgotten one. To a large extent, it remains so to this very day. Grave misunderstandings arise, however, if the reader attempts to pass straight from Volume 1 to Volume 3, underestimating the key place of Volume 2 in the monumental theoretical construction. Marx himself quite precisely clarified this place, in a letter sent to Engels on the 30th of April 1868, in Book 1. We content ourselves with the assumption that if in the self-expansion process £100 becomes £110, the latter will find already in existence in the market the elements into which it will change once more. But now we investigate the conditions under which these elements are found at hand, namely the social intertwining of the different capitals, of the component parts of capital and of revenue, equals S3. This intertwining, conceived as a movement of commodities and of money, enabled Marx to work out at least the essential elements, if not the definitive form of a coherent theory of the trade cycle, based upon the inevitability of periodic disequilibrium between supply and demand under the capitalist mode of production. To forget this role of Volume 2 and jump to Volume 3 carries the danger of evacuating all problems specific to the inner contradictions of the commodity, problems of the market, of the realization of value and surplus value, etc., which, although touched upon in Volume 1, are only fully developed in Volume 2. We may even say that it was only by dealing with the reproduction of capital in its totality that Marx could bring out in their full complexity the inevitable contradictions of the Hassic cell of capitalist wealth. The individual commodity, the intertwining of the different capitals, of the component parts of Tugan Baranowski's studies on the theory and history of the commercial crises in England originally appeared in Russian in 1894. ACCRDING to Rosdolsky. This version was radically different from the famous German edition of 1901 which sparked off the international debate. See Roman Rosdolsky, The Making of Marx's Capital, London, 1977, page 470, note 66. Bulgakov's On the Markets for Capitalist Production was published in Russian in 1897. In autumn 1893, Lenin had made considerable use of Marx's reproduction schemas in a lengthy article on the so-called market question, which was based on a verbal report given to a St. Petersburg Social Democratic Circle in answer to G. Krassen's lecture on the same subject. However, while the article seems to have circulated in manuscript form in Petersburg, it was not published at the time and was thought to have been lost until its publication in 1937. It now appears in Volume 1 of Lenin's collected works. 3. Marx, Engels, Selected Correspondence, Op. Cit. Page 191. Introduction. 13. Capital and of revenue. That dual movement of both specific use values and exchange values, of supply and demand, also enabled Marx to develop an analysis of the reproduction of capitalist economy and bourgeois society in its totality. Of course, in this achievement, which is one of the greatest in the whole of social science, Marx did not have to start out from scratch. He was able to base himself above all on Quesnay's pioneering work, Tableau économique. 4. Nor should it be claimed that Marx solved all problems of reproduction. In particular, he left on JY an unfinished sketch of the section on expanded reproduction and had no time to work on the vexed question of how it can attain occasional equilibrium while encompassing the famous laws of motion, of capital, especially those outlined in Volume 3, Rising Organic Composition of Capital, increasing rate of surplus value. Competition leading to concentration and centralization and to renewed competition, in spite of the tendency of equalization of the rate of profit, tendency of the average rate of profit to decline. Nevertheless, Volume the Second of may be seen in a very real sense as the predecessor and initiator of modern aggregation techniques, which were sometimes even directly inspired by the book. On the road from Keynes through Marx, Walras, Leontief and Keynes, the leap forward made by Marx is immediately apparent. And the movement away from Marx in neoclassical and vulgar macroeconomics contains elements of enormous regression, of which contemporary economists are only now slowly beginning to take note. S4. It should be stressed that from 1758 onwards Keynes' writings demonstrate a clear understanding of a circuit of commodities and income, as well as a grasp that, in the last analysis, all incomes originate in production. See Tableau économique, Extraits des économies réelles de Sully, Explication du tableau économique and Analyse de la forme économique du tableau. 5. For an interesting comparison between Keynes' tableau économique and Marx's reproduction schemas, see Shigeto Tsuru, on reproduction schemes, in Paul M. Sweezy, The Theory of Capitalist Development, New York, 1942, pp. 365 ff. Also worthy of note is Jacques Nagel's Genèse, Contenu et prolongement de la notion de reproduction du capital selling Karl Marx, Boisgaubert, Keynes, Leontief, Bruce, S. 1970. There seems to be a relation between Leontief's input-output tables and the labor theory of value. See, for example, B. Cameron, The Labor Theory of Value in Leontief's Models, an Economic Journal, March 1952. These tables reflect only the use-value interrelationships, exchanges, between different departments, and abstract from the question of the source of the purchasing power necessary to mediate these exchanges. See also Cauchymera's assessment. Leontief, immersed in the minutiae of numerous small departments, fails to abstract or generalize and so ignores both the capital structure as a whole, and the component parts of commodities, i.e. C, V, and M. For this reason his table, while useful for the Statistical 14 Introduction Volume 2 of Capital carries the subtitle, The Process of Circulation of Capital, while Volume 1 was subtitled, The Process of Production of Capital. At first sight, the distinction is clear. Volume 1 is centered around the factory, the workplace. It explains the character of the production of commodities under capitalism as both a process of material production and one of valorization, production of surplus value. 6. Volume 2, by contrast, is centered around the marketplace. It explains not how value and surplus value are produced, but how they are realized. Its dramatis personae are not so much the worker and the industrialist, but rather the money owner and moneylender, the wholesale merchant, the trader and the entrepreneur or functioning capitalist. More broadly defined than Schnapple industrialists, entrepreneurs are those capitalists who, having a certain amount of capital at their disposal, whether they own or borrow it is irrelevant here, try to increase that capital through the purchase of means of production and labor power, the production and then the sale of commodities, the reinvestment of part of realized profit in additional machinery, raw materials and labor power, and the production of an increased quantity of commodities. The role of workers in Volume 2 will cause some surprise, both to non-Marxist readers heavily armed with current academic preconceptions of Marx as an outdated and typically 19th-century economist, and to dogmatic pseudo-Marxists whose understanding of Marx is based more on second-hand vulgarizations than on the genuine article. For if workers appear at all in Volume 2, it is essentially as buyers of consumer goods and, therefore, as sellers of the commodity labor power, rather than as producers of value and surplus value, although, of course, this latter quality, established in Volume 1, remains the solid foundation on which the whole of the unfolding analysis is based. However, in order to grasp the deeper significance of the concept, process of circulation of capital, as well as the exact place of Volume 2 in Marx's Avera Jin Isa of the capitalist mode of production attempted in his 3-volume magnum opus, we have to understand the interconnection between the production of value and its realization. Commodity production is the expression of a specific form of social organization, which encompasses a basic contradiction. On the one hand, human description of empirical phenomena ignores the inner structure of capitalist production. Shinzaburo Cauchymera, Theory of Capital Reproduction and Accumulation, Kitchener, Ont. 1975, page 9. 6. See my Introduction to Capital Volume 1, London, 1976. Introduction 15. Production has outgrown the primitive form of subsistence farming and handicrafts, which prevailed in more or less isolated communities of producer-consumers. The progress of the division of labor and labor productivity, as well as the growth of transport and communications, have steadily increased the range and depth of human interdependence. More and more local, regional, even national and continental communities depend upon one another for the supply and combination of raw materials, instruments of labor and human producers themselves. The labor process has thereby become to an increasing extent objectively socialized. At the same time, however, private ownership of the means of production and circulation combines with the appearance and growth of money, capital to make private appropriation both the starting point and the goal of a productive endeavor. Thus, while labor is objectively IJ10 and more socialized, it remains to a greater degree than ever before organized on the basis of private production. Commodity production, value production, the value form, as Marx calls it at the beginning of Volume 1, rooted in this basic contradiction. 7. Production is impossible without social labor. Without the cooperation of thousands, in some cases, hundreds of thousands, for the production of a given commodity, under optimum conditions of productivity of labor. But since production is based upon and tuned to private appropriation, social labor one's not immediately organized as such. Its input into the production process is not decided by society as a whole, and it is expended as private labor. Its social nature can only be recognized a posteriori, through the sale of the commodity, the realization of its value and, under capitalism, the appropriation in the form of profit by its capitalist owner of a given portion of the total surplus value created by productive workers in their entirety. Value production or commodity production thus expresses the contradictory fact that goods are at one and the same time the product of social labor and private labor, that the social character of the private labor spent in their production cannot be immediately and directly established, and that commodities must circulate, their value must be realized, before we can know the proportion of private labor expended in their production that is recognized as social labor. There is thus an indissoluble unity between the production of value and surplus value on the one hand, and the circulation, sale, of commodities, the realization of value, on the other. Under commodity production, and even so under its capitalist form, the one cannot 7. Ibid. Page 131. 16 Introduction take place without the other. That is why the study of capital in general, provisionally abstracted from competition and many capitals, encompasses both the process of production and the process of circulation of commodities. 8. However, once we begin to examine the circulation of commodities under capitalism, in the first place, their sale with the purpose of realizing their value, we are considering much more than simple commodity circulation. Where in fact dealing with the circulation of commodities is capital, that is to say, with the circulation of capital. In the course of his progressive analysis of the circulation process, Marx introduces a new and passionately interesting object of study, the reproduction and circulation, turnover, of the total social capital. While formally this is the title of only the third part of Volume 2, it could well be argued that it expresses the underlying subject matter of the whole volume. Marx himself explains. 9. That the circulation and reproduction of each individual capital, analysis of which is begun in the first sections of Volume 2, must be seen as part of a more general movement of circulation and reproduction, that of the sum total of social capital. This is so not only because such a study must methodologically precede examination of the effects of competition on the division of surplus value among various capitalist firms, but also because a broader question still has to be answered. How can an anarchic social system, based upon private determination of investment, factor combination, and output, assure the presence of the objective, material elements necessary for further production and growth? What are the absolute preconditions of such growth? It was in order to answer these eminently modern questions that Marx developed his famous reproduction schemas and showed that growth could be accommodated within his theory of capitalism. Since capitalist production is production for profit, value production oriented towards an accretion of value, growth always has the meaning of accumulation of capital. While this is already made clear in Volume 1 of Capi Law, chapters 22 and 23, the argument is only fully elaborated. 8. Marxists have generally attached much less importance to problems of circulation than to those of production, often overlooking their essential unity. A rare example of bending the stick too far in the other direction is the book by the right-wing Austro-Marxist and former president of the Austrian Republic, Dr. Karl Renner. Die Wirtschaft als Gesamtprozess und die Sozialisierung, Berlin, 1924. Renner focuses his analysis entirely on the circulation of commodities and deliberately seeks to make of the sphere of circulation the springboard for the socialization of economic life. 9. See below, pp. 427-30. Introduction 17 in Volume 2. The key concepts are those of capitalization of, part of, surplus value and expanded reproduction. For economic growth to occur, part of the surplus value produced by the working class and appropriated by the capitalists must be spent productively and not wasted unproductively on consumer goods and luxury goods by the ruling class and its retainers and hangers-on. In other words, it must be transformed into additional constant capital, buildings, equipment, energy, raw materials, auxiliary products, etc., and additional variable capital, money capital available to hire an increased labor force. The accumulation of capital is nothing other than this, partial capitalization of surplus value, i.e. the partial transformation of profit into additional capital. Low expanded reproduction denotes a process whereby the turnover of capital, both individual capitals and total social capital, although not necessarily all individual capitals, given competition, we may even say, in the long run, never all capitals, leads, after a certain number of intermediary stages minutely studied in Volume 2, to a larger and larger scale of productive operation. More raw materials are transformed by more workers using more machinery into more finished products, with greater overall value than in the previous turnover cycle. This results in higher total sales and final profits, which in turn allow a higher absolute sum, if not in all cases a higher percentage, of profit to be added to capital. Thus does the spiral of growth continue. The study of the circulation of commodities, the reproduction and accumulation of capital and the rotation of capital in its totality constantly encompasses the dialectical unity and contradiction of opposites contained in the commodity form of production, namely, the contradictory unity of use value and exchange value, doubled in that of commodities and money. One of the outstanding features of Capital Volume 2, to which insufficient attention has been paid by academic and Marxist commentators alike, 11 is precisely the masterly way in which Marx develops this initial theme of Capital Volume 1 throughout his analysis of the process of circulation. We shall have occasion to come back to this. 10. Most significantly, capital accumulation also requires that means of production producing additional means of production be added to means of production producing consumer goods or simply replacing means of production used up in current production. 11. An important exception is Rosdolsky, Op. Cit. 18 Introduction 2. The three forms of capital from the outset, Marx makes it clear that capital, in the capitalist mode of production, 12 appears in three forms: money capital, productive capital and commodity capital. Money capital is the original form and final purpose of the whole devilish undertaking. Productive capital is the basic precondition of the constantly enlarging spiral. Without the penetration of capital into the sphere of production, the social product and surplus product can only be reapportioned and reappropriated, not increased by capitalist enterprise. Under such conditions, capitalists would act essentially as parasites upon and plunderers of pre-capitalist, or post-capitalist, forms of production, rather than as masters of the production and appropriation of surplus value, of the social surplus product. As for commodity capital, it is the basic curse of capitalism that commodities must go through the phase in which they contain, in as yet unrealized form, the surplus value produced by the working class. In other words, before money capital can return to its original form, swollen by surplus value, it has to go through the intermediate stage of commodity value, a value embodied in commodities which still have to pass the acid test by being sold. Marx used the formula, metamorphosis of capital, to indicate that, like a butterfly passing through the successive stages of larva, chrysalis and moth, capital takes on the forms of money capital, productive capital and commodity capital, before returning to the stage of money capital. While these three forms are to a large extent successive in the process of rotation of capital, they are also coexistent with one another. One of the most important and brilliant sections of Volume 2 is that which stresses again and again the discontinuous nature of reproduction of the three forms of capital, and the organic link of this discontinuity with the very essence of the capitalist mode of production. Precisely because the capitalist mode of production is generalized production of commodities, money capital cannot and does not merely precede and succeed the widespread appearance of capital, it has to exist side by side with it. Similarly, money capital is not just the result of the sale of commodities, its social existence is a precondition of that sale. Finally, commodity capital is not simply the outcome of the function 12. This specification is necessary. Although capital may appear and survive in pre-capitalist and post-capitalist societies, ones in transition from capitalism to socialism, it does so essentially outside the realm of production. In no case can it dominate the main sectors of production. This occurs only with the appearance of productive capital, the form proper to the capitalist mode of production. Introduction 19 ing of productive capital, it is also its necessary basis. Indeed, current production is only possible, and this applies especially to commodities with an above-average lifespan or production period, if all commodities produced during the previous turnover cycle have not already been sold to the final consumers, if, that is, stocks and reserves of raw materials, energy, auxiliary products, intermediary products and consumer goods needed to reproduce labor power are available on a large scale. Continuity of the production process may be said to depend upon discontinuity or desynchronization of the turnover cycle of money capital, productive capital and commodity capital. Furthermore, the very nature of capitalist relations of production requires the existence of money capital prior to the initiation of the production process. The separation of free workers from their means of production and livelihood implies a constraint upon the owners of the means of production to purchase labor power before the commencement of productive operations. And they must have at their disposal adequate money capital to effect the transaction. In the relation between capitalist and wage laborer, the money relation, the relation of buyer and seller, becomes a relation inherent in production itself. 13 Thus, to a large extent, Volume 2 examines the constant intertwining of appearance and disappearance of money capital, productive capital and commodity capital, from the sphere of circulation into that of production, and back into the sphere of circulation, until the commodity is finally consumed. Each form passes over into the other, without expelling it entirely from the sphere of circulation, let alone from the overall social arena. Indeed, we can say that the dialectics of money, money capital, and commodities, commodity capital, is the basic contradiction examined in Capital Volume 2. Here again Marx's modernism is particularly striking. These considerations show the crucial importance of the time factor in Marx's analysis of the capitalist mode of production. Its functioning cannot be understood if complete abstraction is made of time sequences and schedules, the duration of the production and turnover cycles of commodities, and the length of the turnover period of capital. Marx's important distinction between circulating capital and fixed capital is based exclusively on the amount of time required for each of these two parts of money capital to revert to its original form. Circulating capital, spent on raw materials and wages, is recovered by the capitalist firm after each production cycle and circulation cycle of commodities. Fixed 13. See below, page 196. 20 Introduction capital, however, is recovered in its entirety only after n cycles of production and circulation, whose number depends on the longevity of machinery and buildings. As is well known, Marx WQRKED on the hypothesis that the average longevity of machinery, not, of course, buildings, is equivalent to, and indeed determines, the average duration of the trade cycle. It would be a fruitful task for Marxist scholars to deepen our understanding of the role and function of this time dimension in Marx's Capital. For time appears there as the measure of production, value and surplus value, labor time, as the nexus connecting production, circulation and reproduction of commodities and capital, cycles of turnover and reproduction of capital, as the medium of the laws of motion of capital, trade cycles, cycles of class struggle, long-term historical cycles, and as the very essence of man, leisure time, lifespan, creative time, time of social intercourse. The study of the process of circulation of commodities and capital is concerned essentially with metamorphosis, the change from one form to another which we have just mentioned. But this analysis, starting from a high level of abstraction and drawing nearer and nearer to the everyday phenomena of capitalist life, itself represents this process of circulation in successive stages of concreteness. First, there is the circulation of money, capital in its most general form as we encountered it in Volume 1, MCM, M plus AM. Money buys commodities so that they may be sold with an accretion of money. A profit, part of which will be added to the initial money capital. If we translate this formula into the real operations of the capitalist mode of production, we have to replace C, the commodities bought, with the specific operation of the industrialist, namely, the purchase of means of production and labor power in order that the labor power may produce additional value, surplus value. This combination of means of production and labor power gives rise, through the process of production, to new commodities embodying additional value which have to be sold to result in the formation of accumulated capital. 2. The initial formula becomes MC less than P. Production. C M. M plus AM, where AM equals accumulated surplus value. Introduction 21.3. The dual aspect of capital turnover in Marx's economic theory basing himself on the contradiction between use value and exchange value inherent in the commodity, Marx considered the problem of turnover of capital, of reproduction, as a dual one. In order that, at least simple, and normally expanded, reproduction may be achieved, the total value embodied in the produced commodities must be realized, that is to say, they must be sold at their value. Contrary. To assumptions made by some of his most astute followers, principally Rudolf Hilferding, Otto Bauer and Nikolai Bukharin, Marx did not regard this process of realization as automatic, nor did he derive it from his reproduction schemas, as some have naively suggested. 14. Indeed, a substantial section of the final part of Volume 2, and most of the controversies which have been raging ever since Rosa Luxemburg raised the issue, have turned around a more or less detailed examination of how the value embodied in commodities as represented by the famous reproduction schemas could be realized by purchasing power generated in the production process. At the same time, at least simple, and normally expanded, reproduction require for their success that the use value of the commodities produced should fulfill the material conditions for restarting production on either the existing or a broader scale. Reproduction could not take place in a situation where, on a technological base lower than total automation and in the absence of food reserves, the commodity package consisted entirely of raw materials and machinery. The workers and capitalists would starve and disappear before the available machinery could be used to restart agricultural production, or the existing stock of raw materials could be transformed into synthetic food. Similarly, reproduction would be impossible where the entire output of current commodity production, carried out with the large-scale use of sophisticated machinery, was composed of consumer goods and raw materials. If there were no stocks of machinery or spare parts, then machinery and 14. See especially Rudolf Hilferding, Das Finanzkapital, Vienna, 1923, page 310. Nikolai Bukharin, Imperialism and the Accumulation of Capital, London, 1972, page 226. And Otto Bauer, Die Accumulation des Kapitals in die Neue Zeit, Volume 31, 1913. 22. Introduction production would break down before the well-fed workers could build new machines out of simple raw materials. We should add in passing that expanded reproduction, which is the norm under capitalism, does not demand merely the existence, previous production, of use values representing the necessary objective elements of reproduction, means of production to replace used-up equipment and raw materials, further means of production required to enlarge the scale of operation of material production, consumer goods to feed both already employed workers and additional recruits to the workforce. Expanded reproduction also demands the presence of a potential source of additional labor. The dual function of the industrial reserve army of labor, both as regulator of wages, assuring that the rate of surplus value remains above a certain level, and as material precondition of expanded reproduction, should not be overlooked. If traditional means of increasing or maintaining that reserve army are drying up where, for example, independent peasants, handicraftsmen and shopkeepers have declined as a proportion of the total active population, or where substitution of machines for men in industry is slowing down, then new sources can always be tapped through sweeping transformation of housewives into wage laborers, mass immigration of labor, extensive redeployment of student youth onto the labor market, and so on.
1S Marx's giant step forward in economic analysis may be gauged by the fact that, until this very day, most academic economists have still not fully grasped this basic innovation of his schemas of reproduction.
They have broken up the totality of the process of reproduction of capital, based upon this unity of opposites, into a disconnected dichotomy. On the one hand, analysis centers on physical coefficients, especially at the level of interbranch exchanges, as in Leontief's input-output tables and all their derivations. It deals with use values. On the other hand, as in the case of Keynesian and post-Keynesian treatises 16, the study focuses on money flows, income flows, that is to say on exchange values largely disembodied from the commodities in the production of which 15. See Ernest Mandel, Late Capitalism, London, 1975, pp. 170-71. 16. Paul Samuelson's Economics, 4th edition, New York, 1958, page 41, attempts to correlate revenue flows and commodity flows by means of an interrelated system of supply-demand markets. But it is the public which buys consumer goods, while selling land, labor and capital goods, factors of production, to business, one-foot business, in turn buys land, labor and capital from the public, and Introduction 23 they originated. Income theories are thereby more and more disconnected from production theories, and if the mediation of the production function is employed at all, it remains largely inoperative, being considered at the microeconomic level rather than the macroeconomic one. Above all, the constant combination and intertwining of the two. The obvious fact that incomes are generated in the production of commodities with a given use value, corresponding to the structure of socially recognized needs, and that disequilibrium is unavoidable without a structure of income congruent with that of value produced. This has not even been posed, still less tackled by traditional academic theory, with the marginal exception of certain students of the trade cycle and the theory of crisis. The technique of aggregation introduced by Keynes has, if anything, made matters even more confused by operating with undifferentiated money flows. For it evacuates the problem, not to mention its solution, of whether a given national income has a specific structure of demand, for consumer goods, for producer goods producing producer goods, for producer goods producing consumer goods, for luxury goods, for weapons and other commodities bought only by the state, etc., which corresponds exactly to the specific structure of the total commodity value created in the process of production. In fact, most of the relevant academic theory, and not a little post-Marxian Marxist theory as well, for a long time assumed some kind of Say's law to be operative. 7. That is to say, it took for granted that a given value structure of output is correlated with a congruent income structure of purchasing power, through the normal operation of market forces. One of Marx's major purposes in Volume 2 of Capital sells consumer goods to it. Samuelson does not seem to have noticed that, under capitalism, the public, i.e. the mass of consumers, does not own capital goods, i.e. raw materials and equipment, and that these are sold by certain businesses to others. In his system, capital goods are sold without having been produced. It should be noted that Marx's reproduction schemas are not only of greater analytical and theoretical rigor, at the same time, they are more realistic, that is to say, they conform more closely to the real organization of capitalist economic life than the mystifying constructions of many species of academic economics. 17. For example, Oscar Lange, in his lengthy and interesting discussion of the reproduction schemas and derived equilibrium formulae, constantly abstracts from the dual flow of commodities and money, and assumes a relationship of pure barter between the two departments. See Oscar Lange, Theory of Reproduction and Accumulation, Warsaw, 1969, pp. 24, 28, etc. 24 Introduction is to show that this is not so, that such congruence depends upon certain exact proportions and structures, both of exchange values and of use values, that, for instance, wages never buy machines under capitalism, and that these exact proportions are extremely difficult to realize in the actual practice of capitalism.
It is thus all the more surprising that Joan Robinson reproaches Marx for having failed to realize how much the orthodox theory stands and falls with Say's law and set himself the task of discovering a theory of crises which would apply to a world in which Say's law was fulfilled, as well as the theory which arises when Say's law is exploded. Point 18 Would it not be more correct to state that Robinson herself, following Keynes's concept of effective demand, fails to realize how much Marx's theory of the commodity as a unity and contradiction of use value and exchange value not only underpins his concept of the necessary fluctuation of supply and demand at a macroeconomic level, but actually intertwines it with his theory of income distribution, demand distribution, in capitalist society.
Under capitalism, income distribution has a class structure determined by the very structure of the mode of production, and governed in the medium term by the class interests of the capitalists. Any increase in effective demand, which, instead of increasing the rate of profit, causes it to decline will never lead to a boom under capitalism. That basic truth was well understood by Ricardo as well as Marx. Though it is not by many latter-day Keynesians. We said earlier that one of the basic functions of the reproduction schemas is to demonstrate that growth, the very existence of capitalism, is at least possible under the capitalist mode of production. Given the extremely anarchic nature of the organization of production, under laissez-faire capitalism on the home market, under monopoly capitalism on the world market, and given the very nature of competition, this is by no means as obvious as it sounds. The reproduction schemas locate the combination of value and use value structures of the total commodity package within which growth can occur. But Marx never sought to prove that these proportions are automatically and constantly guaranteed by the invisible hand of market forces. On the contrary, he insisted again and again. 19. That these proportions are difficult to realize and impossible permanently to retain, and that they are 18. Joan Robinson, An Essay on Marxian Economics, New York, 1966, page 51. 19. Cf. Below. The fact that the production of commodities is the general form of capitalist production already implies that money plays a role, not just as means of circulation, but also as money capital within the circulation sphere, and gives. Introduction 25. Automatically upset by those same forces that bring them occasionally into being. In other words, the reproduction schemas show that equilibrium, not to speak of equilibrated growth, is the exception and not the rule under capitalism. That disproportions are far more frequent than proportionality, and that growth, being essentially uneven, inevitably produces the breakdown of growth, contracted reproduction or crisis. When we say that Marx's reproduction schemas summarize the turnover of capital and commodities as a dual movement, we mean that they are based upon a combined dual flow, a flow of value produced in the process of production, and a flow of money, money revenue and money capital, unleashed in the process of circulation in order to realize the value of the commodities produced. The schemas are evidently not based upon barter. Department I does not exchange goods with Department I simply according to mutual need. Before the capitalists or employed workers of Department I can obtain the goods they need, they must prove themselves to have sufficient purchasing power to buy them from Department II at their value. 20. Furthermore, the difficulty cannot be solved by some legerdemain such as the sudden introduction ex nihilo of additional sources of purchasing power. If new sources of money do appear, and we shall see that they play a key role in Marx's schemas, they must be organically connected with the problem under examination. In other words, it has to be demonstrated that they are necessarily coexistent with the process of production and circulation of commodities under the capitalist mode of production. The dual nature of the reproduction schemas, reflecting the dual nature of the commodity and commodity production in general, in no way circumvents or contradicts the operation of the law of value. A law which establishes, among other things, that the quantity and quality of value produced, both that of each individual commodity and that of the total sum of commodities, is independent of their use value. Use value rise to certain conditions for normal exchange that are peculiar to this mode of production, conditions for the normal course of reproduction, whether simple or on an expanded scale, which turn into an equal number of conditions for an abnormal course, possibilities of crisis, since, on the basis of the spontaneous pattern of this production, this balance is itself an accident, pp. 5771. Cf. Also Karl Marx, Grundrisse, London, 1973, pp. 413-14, 20. In Volume 2 of Capital, which, like Volume 1, features in Marx's general plan under the heading See Capital in General, Das Kapital im Allgemeinen, the author consciously abstracts from competition. Therefore, prices of production play no part, and calculations are strictly value calculations. 26. Introduction is a necessary precondition of commodity value. A good which nobody wants to buy because it fulfills no need cannot be sold, and therefore has no exchange value. Labor expended in its production is socially wasted, not socially necessary labor. Similarly, a certain use value structure of total output, a given quantity of X raw materials, Y pieces of equipment and Z types of consumer goods, is a material and social precondition of the successful accomplishment of simple or expanded reproduction. But the use value of these commodities will only be realized if their market prices can be matched, that is, if they can be bought. Millions can, and do, starve under capitalism, even though all the food they need is there, because they lack the purchasing power to buy it. Of course they would also starve if the food were really lacking, but, although this does happen occasionally, it is a much rarer occurrence. Moreover, the system will be in equilibrium. Expanded reproduction will be possible in value terms, only if these commodities are broadly speaking sold at their value, that is to say, if the surplus value produced by the working class is realized in the form of profit. And this is by no means assured under capitalism. A further preliminary condition of equilibrium has to be fulfilled before the dual flow of commodities and purchasing power between the departments can even be examined. The sum total of output of both departments must be equal to, not smaller or larger than, the total demand generated by expanded reproduction. Under simple reproduction this may be expressed as follows. I equals IC plus IIC2 equals IV plus is plus IIV plus IIs. Under expanded reproduction this becomes I equals IC plus AIC plus IIC plus AIIC2 equals IV plus AIV plus is AIC AIV plus IIV plus AIV plus IIs AIIC AIV. The value and mass of the means of production produced must be equal to the value and mass of the means of production used up in both departments during the current production period, plus, under conditions of expanded reproduction, the value of the additional means of production needed in both departments. The value and mass of the consumer goods produced must be equal to the demand for consumer goods, wages plus profits spent on unproductive consumption in both departments. Introduction 27.4. The significance of Marx's reproduction scheme is the so-called conditions of proportionality in a two-department system, where the total mass of commodities is classified into a department I of means of production and a department I of consumer goods, were formulated by Marx himself. In the case of simple reproduction, they are IV plus LS equals Li. Otto Bauer and Bukharin derived from this a similar formula for expanded reproduction, which, although present in Volume 2, was not explicitly formulated by Marx. 21. IV plus ISCX plus ISY equals Li plus IISP. 22. In conformity with the dual nature of the reproduction schemas, these conditions of proportionality simultaneously have two meanings. A. The exchange value of the goods sold by Department I to Department 2 must be equal to the value of the goods sold by Department 2 to Department I, otherwise, there would emerge an unsaleable surplus in at least one of the two departments. B. The specific use value of the commodities produced in both departments must correspond to their mutual needs. For instance, the purchasing power in the hands of the workers producing producer goods must encounter on the market not only commodities, but actual consumer goods equivalent to that sum of wages. Under capitalism, workers are not supposed to spend their money on any commodities other than consumer goods. The commodity, non-barter nature of the reproduction schemas further implies a dual flow between the two departments. When Department I sells raw materials and equipment to Department II, to replace the value of Li used up in the previous production cycle, commodities flow from Department I to Department II, while money flows from 21. See below, page 593-22. Total surplus value, S, in both departments is divided into three parts. A. Unproductively consumed by the capitalists. Fj. Accumulated in the form of constant capital. Accumulated in the form of variable capital. 28. Introduction Department II to Department I. It has to be determined where that money initially came from. Conversely, when Department II sells consumer goods to the workers of Department I, to enable them to reproduce their labor power, commodities flow from 2 to I, while money flows from I to II. From a purely technical point of view, there is nothing extraordinary or magical in this two-department schema. It is just the most elementary conceptual tool. An extreme simplification intended to bring out the underlying assumptions of equilibrium, or equilibrated, proportionate growth, under conditions of commodity production. For exchange to occur, there must exist at least two private capitals independent of each other. With these conceptual tools, it would be easy to draw up a three-department model, e.g. with gold as Department 3, or a four-department one, with both gold and luxury goods as additional departments, the difference between the two being that, while luxury goods are, like weapons, useless from the point of view of reproduction, gold does not enter into the reproduction process but mediates it, assisting the circulation of commodities for expanded reproduction. We could then move on to a five-department model, dividing Department I into means of production producing means of production and means of production producing consumer goods, or a seven-department one, further dividing both sub-departments of Department I into raw materials and machinery. Step by step, we would approach an inter-branch model reflecting the actual structure of a modern capitalist industrialized economy. 2. 3. A certain number of conditions of physical interdependence would have to be established among all these branches. They are clarified by Leontief's input-output tables, based on either stable or changing technology. These would then have to be supplemented by a table of value equivalence, value equilibrium, since the only condition for equilibrium is overall realization of value. At this point, there appears an important difference between a two-department schema and a multi-department one. The former necessitates equivalence of exchange values between the two departments, whereas this is not true of the latter. 23. Department 3 was first used by Tugun Baranowski, studying zur Theorie und Geschichte der Handelskrisen in England, Jena, 1901, and von Bortkiewicz as a means of representing the production of luxury goods or gold. Unknown to Tugun Baranowski and other participants in that discussion, Marx had himself used a four-department schema in the Grundriss, op. Cit. Page 441, introducing separate departments for raw materials and machinery and, like Tugun Baranowski, dividing the means of consumption between a department of workers' consumer goods and one of luxury goods, surplus products, destined for the capitalists.
Introduction 29. Department C, for instance, say, raw materials necessary for the production of consumer goods, could have a surplus in its interchange with Department E, finished mass consumer goods in a 9-department schema, where F is the luxury goods department and G the gold production one, while it had a deficit in its interchange with Department B, equipment for the production of producer goods, including raw materials. 24. In such a case, the system would still attain equilibrium provided that all the surpluses and deficits cancelled one another out for each department were interrelated in a definitely proportionate and not arbitrary manner, and provided that each department realized the total value of the commodities produced within it and disposed of sufficient purchasing power to acquire the necessary objective elements of expanded reproduction, which would have to be supplied with their specific use values by the current production of departments A to E. However, the picture changes once we consider the two-department schema not as a simple conceptual or analytical tool, but as a model corresponding to a social structure.
It then becomes clear that the choice of these two departments as basic subdivisions of the mass of commodities produced is not at all an arbitrary one, but corresponds to the essential character of human production in general, not merely its specific expression under capitalist relations of production. Man cannot survive without establishing a material metabolism with nature. And he cannot realize that metabolism without using tools. His material production will, therefore, always consist of at least tools and means of subsistence. The two departments of Marx's reproduction schemas are nothing other than the specific capitalist form of this general division of human production, insofar as they 1. Take the generalized form of commodities, and 2. Assume that the workers, direct producers, do not. 24. In order to avoid confusion, we shall use for a 9-department schema the letters A, B, I, rather than the Roman capitals I, etc. Thus, A denotes the department of raw materials used in the production of means of production. B. Equipment employed in the production of means of production. C. Raw materials used for the production of mass consumer goods. D. Equipment employed in the production of mass consumer goods. E. Raw materials used for the production of luxury goods. F. Equipment employed in the production of luxury goods. G. Mass consumer goods. H. Luxury goods, and other goods not entering into the reproduction process. E.g. weapons. I. Gold. The Soviet economist V.S. Dadain has constructed a sophisticated feedback system for expanded reproduction which is based on a 4-department system. A. Means of production. B. Raw materials. C. Mass consumer goods. D. Elements of non-productive funds and the rest of social production. See V.S. Dadain. Ökonomische Berechnungen nach dem Modell der erweiterten Reproduktion. Berlin, 1969. 30. Introduction and cannot purchase that part of the commodity mountain which consists of tools and raw materials. 2s. Revert G to the 2-department schema presented in capital VO Fume 2. We can now outline the dual flow of commodities and money between the 2 departments, both in the case of simple reproduction and in that of expanded reproduction. 1. Simple reproduction. In Department I, the workers buy commodities from Department 2 to the equivalent of their wages, and the capitalists to the equivalent of their profits. Both these flows are continuous. Workers and capitalists alike have to eat every day, regardless of whether Department I commodities have already been sold. Therefore, even simple reproduction requires the prior existence of money capital and money reserves, for revenue expenditure, in the hands of the capitalist class over and above the value of productive capital. 26. With the money received from the sale of their commodities, the capitalists of Department I buy from Department I the means of production needed to reconstitute their own constant capital used up during the production process. This money returning to Department I, after mediating the purchase and sale of means of production within that department, reconstitutes the initial money capital and money revenue reserve with which the whole turnover process can recommence. Similarly, within Department I the capitalists sell consumer goods to their own workers and thereby immediately reconstitute their own variable capital. They sell consumer and luxury goods to all industrialists active within that department, thus realizing the surplus value contained in the sum total of consumer goods produced. 2. Expanded reproduction. Workers and capitalists of Department I buy consumer goods from Department I to a total value of IV plus ISCZ. With this money, capitalists of Department I buy means of production from Department I in order to reconstitute their own constant capital used up. 25. Rudolf Hickel, Zur Interpretation der Marxischen Reproduktionsschemata, page 116 and page 7. Of footnotes, criticizes our use of a Department III, thinking that we justify it by the fact that the state buys weapons or by the notion that weapons are waste. This critique is altogether unfounded. The objective basis of Department III lies in the fact that it includes all commodities not entering into the reproduction process, with the possible exception of monetary gold, in a 4-department schema. 26. See below, pp. 548-9. Introduction 31. During the production process. 27. Now, capitalists of Department I have the necessary means, if required, by drawing further on a reserve of money capital, to mediate the circulation of C within their own department and to hire additional workers, who will buy additional consumer goods, to the equivalent of ISI, from Department 2. The capitalists of Department I thereby acquire the purchasing power to buy from Department I the additional means of production necessary for their own expanded reproduction. Lisp. Equals AIIE, while the sale of consumer goods to workers and capitalists within Department I operates as described above. Finally, with the further means obtained by the sale of AIIE to Department II, the capitalists of Department I can complete their own expanded reproduction, mediating the sale of ale within their department, as well as the purchase of the equivalent of A1V from Department 1I, if this has not been fully covered in the first stage of circulation. 5. Use and misuse of the reproduction schemas. Marx's reproduction schemas have been used and abused in a number of ways during the past 70 years, ever since their analytical usefulness began to strike the imagination of followers and opponents alike. We have already indicated one of the most paradoxical forms of abuse of the schemas, namely, utilization of them as proof that capitalism could grow harmoniously and unrestrictedly, if only the correct proportions between the departments, the conditions of equilibrium, were maintained. The authors responsible for this aberration overlooked the basic assumption made by Marx, that the very structure of the capitalist mode of production, as well as its laws of motion, imply that the conditions of equilibrium are inevitably destroyed, that equilibrium and Harmonious growth are marginal exceptions to, are long-term averages of, normal conditions of disequilibrium, overshooting, between the two departments, and uneven growth. We have dwelt on this problem elsewhere and shall not repeat the argumentation here. Suffice it to say that, under capitalism, both the dynamics of value determination and the non-determination of consumer expenditure make it impossible to maintain exact proportions between the two departments in such a way as to have harmonious growth. The very nature of expanded reproduction, capitalist reproduction. 27. Following the equilibrium formula, IIC plus 11.8p equals IV plus I8 plus ISE, it is clear that IIE may be equal to, or smaller or greater than IV plus I6, depending on the relation of I as Fj to ISE. 32. Introduction under capitalism implies that production takes place not only on a broader scale, but also under changed technological conditions. Constant revolutions in the technique and cost of production are a basic characteristic of the system which Marx underlined much more sharply than any of his contemporaries, including the admirers and sycophants of capitalism. But these constant revolutions entail that the value of commodities as a social datum is subject to periodic change. It follows that values at input level do not automatically determine values at output level. CNIY after a certain interval will it be shown whether a fraction of the inputs have been socially wasted. Neither the subjective win of monopolies or the state, nor the cleverness of neo-Keynesian planners, can prevent the assertion of the law of value where private property and competition hold sway. Nothing can stop these long-term shifts in commodity values from leading to a redistribution of living labor inputs among different branches of production, and, ultimately, a redistribution of means of production as well. Similarly, the avoidance of crises of overproduction requires proportionality not only between departments, but also between output and final consumption, i.e. consumption by the mass of wage and salary earners, above all in modern industrialized societies, where they generally form with their families more than 80% of the total number of consumers. But this is impossible for two reasons. In the first place, the one freedom which cannot normally be taken away from the workers is the freedom to spend their wages as they wish. And there is no way in which it can be forecast with complete accuracy how they will do this. Even if a prediction is 95% correct, that could still leave a 5% surplus of unsaleable consumer goods, which is enough to start an avalanche. Second, JY. The laws of motion of capitalism have the inherent tendency to develop the capacity of production, including the production of consumer goods, beyond the limits within which the mode of production confines the purchasing power of those condemned to sell their labor power. Thus, disproportion is intrinsic to the system itself. 28. However, it is not enough for a Marxist theory of the trade cycle and of crisis to demonstrate the reality of that inherent disproportion, which is, after all, almost a truism, given the regular recurrence of crises of overproduction for more than 150 years, it must also discover. 28. C. Grundrisse, Op. Cit. Page 414. Crossing also Capital Volume 3, Chapter 15, 3, where Marx states that under capitalism, the proportionality of the particular branches of production presents itself as a constant process through disproportionality. Introduction. 33. The precise mechanisms which relate that periodic disequilibrium to the basic laws of motion of capitalism. In the Soviet Union and other countries where capitalism has been overthrown, Marx's reproduction schemas have been widely used as instruments of socialist planning. We do not deny that, by analogy, these schemas may be useful tools for studying specific problems of interdepartment structure and dynamics in all kinds of society. But it has first to be clearly understood what is being done in such a case. For, we repeat, the schemas refer to commodity production and to dual flows of commodities and money incomes. To extend their use to societies which have transcended generalized commodity production, where the means of production are, in their essential mass, 29 use values distributed by the state, the planning authorities, according to a plan, rather than commodities sold on the basis of their value. This leads to an accumulation of paradoxes, of which the authors are generally not even conscious. A good example is provided by the late Maurice Daub. In the 50s, he participated in a great debate among Soviet and East European economists revolving around Stalin's so-called law of the priority development of the means of production under socialism, and the establishment of an optimum rate of growth for both departments. 30. Forgetting that what was involved in Marx's reproduction schemas was value calculation of commodities, Daub proved that an increased rate of growth of consumer goods in the future was impossible, unless the present rate of growth of Department I was higher than that of Department II. Now, a policy which sacrifices the consumption of 4 generations of workers and their families merely to increase the rate of growth of that consumption starting, nith the 5th generation has nothing in common with an ideal socialist norm, and cannot be rationally motivated except in terms of purely political contingencies. For Daub's argumentation is, of course, completely spurious. All that his calculation shows that the value of consumer goods produced cannot grow at an increasing rate after X years unless the value of Department I immediately rises at a faster rate than that of Department I. However, neither an individual worker nor the working class itself. In 29. The exceptions are those means of production which are sold to agricultural cooperatives and small handicraftsmen or illegally channeled into the black, parallel market. 30. Maurice Daub, On Economic Theory and Socialism, London, 1955, pp. 330-31, ISO 51, and elsewhere. 34 Introduction: A post-capitalist society, not to speak of a socialist commonwealth, as interested in a constantly rising rate of growth of the value of consumer goods. On the contrary, they are concerned with reducing that value as much as possible by raising the productivity of labor, and with the withering away of commodity production and market economy. Their basic interests lie in the most rapid optimum satisfaction of rational consumer needs, the production at lowest possible cost of an optimum basket of consumer goods, thereby combining maximum economy of the labor of the producers with maximum satisfaction of consumer needs. To believe that this is the same as maximization of capitalist commodity value, or profit, is to commit not only a grave theoretical error, but also a disastrous political and social miscalculation. Even worse were the attempts made in the 60s to revive a so-called structural law of socialism, according to which department I must expand at a faster rate than Department 2. 31 All such endeavors abstract from the value nature of the reproduction schemas, and assume that optimum satisfaction of social needs implies both continuous, unlimited expansion of the output of means of production, and the allocation of an even higher fraction of the total labor potential of society to the creation of material producer goods, as against social services dealing with health, education, artistic creation, pure, scientific research, childcare, etc., etc. None of these assumptions can be scientifically proven or justified. Indeed, their apologetic function as a straightforward rationalization of existing practice in the USSR and the people's democracies is obvious to any critical observer. It should be added that both Oscar Lange and Bronislaw Mink, while not clarifying the difference between capitalist and socialist reproduction schemas, correctly demonstrated that increased productivity of labor and technical progress do not necessarily require Department I to grow more quickly than Department II, nor do they imply increased current outlay on means of production per unit currently, annually, produced. 32 Rosa Luxemburg well understood that the form of the reproduction 31. C. Inter alia, P. M. Mstislawski, on the methodology to justify optimal proportions of social reproduction, in Wyprosie Ekonomiki, No. 5, 1964. Helmut Kojolik, Aktuelle Probleme der politischen Ökonomie, Berlin, 1966. Rudolf Reichenberg, Struktur und Wachstum der Abteilungen I und II im Sozialismus, Berlin, 1968. 32. C. Lang, Op. Cit. pp. 32-3, and Bronislaw Mink, Aktuellen Zagadnienia Ekonomii Politische Sozialismu, Current Problems in the Political Economy of Socialism, Warsaw, 1956. Introduction 35 Schemas applies only to capitalist commodity and value production, and that the laws of motion corresponding to that form can have no validity in non-capitalist societies. But even she erred by attaching to the equilibrium proportions derived from the schemas in a historical, eternal valid way which they do not and cannot possess. 3. If a socially appropriated surplus product is substituted for surplus value, then the equilibrium formula takes on a new form which expresses the different social goal of reproduction, corresponding to the changed social structure. Surplus value is not simply a part of the total value of commodities produced under capitalism, nor is it just a fraction of the newly produced value product, the national income. It is also the goal of the capitalist production process. As such, it is much more than a mere symbol in a reproduction schema which is intended to represent reality at a high level of abstraction. For Marx, the schemas refer to the reproduction of quantified use value and exchange value in a given proportion. But they also express the reproduction of capitalist relations of production themselves. 34 All that is implied in the formula IV plus is equals IIC, and all that changes under socialism, once S disappears. Furthermore, in a society where commodity production has withered away, and where the concept of surplus labor is essentially reducible to that of social service and economic growth, the meaning of the notion of equilibrium, derived from the proportionality formula, is subject to a fundamental transformation. When proportionality is upset in a commodity-producing society, production of both use values and exchange values declines, because both are inextricably linked to each other. Under socialism, however, no such inexorable nexus survives. Not even as a necessary proportion, in the form of an eternal law, between labor inputs and use value inputs. Indeed, in Capital Volume 2, Marx goes so far as to state categorically that, after the abolition of capitalism, there will be constant relative overproduction, of Equip 33. Rosa Luxemburg, The Accumulation of Capital, London, 1963, pp.84-5. Earlier, however, she had specifically stated, in every planned system of production it is, above all, the relation between all labor, past and present, and the means of production, between versus plus S and C, according to our formula, or the relation between the aggregate of necessary consumer goods, again, in the terms of our formula, V plus S, and C which are subjected to regulation. Under capitalist conditions, on the other hand, all social labor necessary for the maintenance of the inanimate means of production and also of living labor power is treated as one entity, as capitic in contrast with the surplus labor that has been performed, i.e. with the surplus value S. The relation between these two quantities C and V plus S, as a palpably real, objective relationship of capitalist society, it is the average rate of profit, IBID. Page 79, 34. See Capital Volume 3, Chapter 51. 36 Introduction meant, raw materials and foodstuffs. Overproduction of this kind, he says, is equivalent to control by the society over the objective means of its own reproduction. 35. It is easy to imagine a society which, having reached a certain level of consumption, consciously decides to give absolute priority to a single goal, reduction of the workload. Its efforts would then be concentrated on assuring the production and distribution of an ideal package of use values with fewer and fewer labor inputs. There would still be simple reproduction at the level of use values, but it would be achieved with, let us say, a reduction in man days of 4% per annum, if population increased by 1% and labor productivity by 5%. To call this a situation of contracted reproduction would be wrong, both because a socialist society would calculate essentially with use values, and because in Marx's reproduction schema the concept of contracted reproduction is logically connected with the notions of crisis, interrupted economic equilibrium and declining living standards, whereas the conditions just described involve smooth continuity of material production and reproduction, stable living standards and absence of any kind of crisis. This does not mean that planned socialist production could do without specific proportions in the flow of labor, means of production and consumer goods between the two departments. Such proportional allocation of resources is indeed the very essence of socialist planning. It means only that there is a qualitative as well as a quantitative difference between value calculations and calculations in labor time. Between the dynamics of, on the one hand, appropriation and accumulation of surplus value, and, on the other hand, rising efficiency, labor productivity, achieved in successive phases of production and measured in quantities of use values produced during a fixed length of time. 36-35. See below, pp. 544-5, 36. Cf. The following passage from Engels is anti-Dühring. From the moment when society enters into possession of the means of production and uses them in direct association for production, the labor of each individual, however varied its specifically useful character may be, becomes at the start and directly social labor. The quantity of social labor contained in a product need not then be established in a roundabout way. Daily experience shows in a direct way how much of it is required on the average. Society can simply calculate how many hours of labor are contained in a steam engine, a bushel of wheat of the last harvest, or 100 square yards of cloth of a certain quality. It could therefore never occur to it still to express the quantities of labor put into the products, quantities which it will then know directly and in their absolute amounts, in a third product, in a measure which, besides, is only relative, fluctuating, inadequate, though formerly unavoidable for. Introduction. 37. Mink goes much farther than Luxemburg when, summing up the opinion of two generations of Stalinist and post-Stalinist East European and Soviet economists, he clearly asserts, the basic theses of Marx's theory of expanded reproduction, as expressed in the schemas, are entirely valid under socialism. 3. 7. Contrary to the explicit theory of lack of a better, rather than express them in their natural, adequate and absolute measure, time. Just as little as it would occur to chemical science still to express atomic weights in a roundabout way, relatively, by means of the hydrogen atom, if it were able to express them absolutely, in their adequate measure, namely in actual weights, in billionths or quadrillionths of a gram. Hence, on the assumptions we made above, society will not assign values to products. It will not express the simple fact that the 100 square yards of cloth have required for their production, say, 1,000 hours of labor in the oblique and meaningless way, stating that they have the value of 1,000 hours of labor. It is true that even then it will still be necessary for society to know how much labor each article of consumption requires for IH production. It will have to arrange its plan of production in accordance with its means of production, which include, in particular, its labor power. The useful effects of the various articles of consumption, compared with one another and with the quantities of labor required for their production, will in the end determine the plan. Frederick Engels, Anti-Dühring, Moscow, 1969, pp. 366-7. Cf. Also Marx's observation, let us finally imagine, for a change, an association of free men, working with the means of production held in common, and expending their many different forms of labor power in full self-awareness as one single social labor force. Labor time would in that case ply a do ble part. Its apportionment in accordance with a definite social plan maintains the correct proportion between the different functions of labor and the various needs of the associations. On the other hand, labor time also serves as a measure of the part taken by each individual in the common labor, and of his share in the part of the total product destined for individual consumption. Capital Volume 1, Op. Cit. pp.171-2. To what theoretical contortions the confusion of capitalist and socialist reproduction schemas necessarily leads is strikingly demonstrated by Reichenberg, Op. Dt. First, he calmly includes the material tools of the service sector in a department II of consumer goods, page 16. Next, he speaks of an intensification of expanded reproduction as a result of the scientific technical revolution. An intensification which expresses itself in the fact that, if the difference between IV pluses and IIE remains the same, a process of increased accumulation is possible, page 21. But he fails to specify the object of this accumulation. Is it the value of IIE? Obviously that would be nonsense. The difference between two value quantities cannot change if the quantities themselves do not change. Perhaps it is accumulation of use values? No doubt. But surely an increase in the mass of raw materials and tools, for the output of consumer goods, produced by a given quantity of socially necessary labor is the very definition of an increase in labor productivity. And, at the same time, Reichenberg implies that the value of these goods, and therefore the dynamics of expanded reproduction in value terms, has not changed. 37. Bronislaw W. Mine. L. Économie politique du socialisme. Paris, 1974, page 167. 38 Introduction. Marx and Engels, such, socialist production, will thus remain generalized commodity production, generalized production of value. We may well ask what kind of intrinsic law of raising surplus labor would then be incorporated into these socialist production relations. For Marx distinctly states that such a law underlies the schemas of expanded reproduction referring to the production of surplus value. 38.6. Productive and unproductive labor. Marx's theory of reproduction is firmly rooted in his perfected labor theory of value, not only in the sense that his reproduction schemas are based upon a common numeraire, labor time, but also in the sense that what they measure and express is the distribution and movement of the labor force available to society among different departments and branches of material production. Value, in Marx's theory, is abstract social labor. Michio Morishima, who has devoted much effort and ingenuity to rehabilitating Marx in the eyes of academic economists as one of the principal forerunners of aggregation techniques, nevertheless continues to detect a contradiction between a macroeconomic theory of value, based upon aggregation, and a microeconomic labor theory of value. While dismissing the trite contradiction between Volume 1 and Volume 38. In this way, a situation comes about in which the individual capitalists have command of increasingly large armies of workers, no matter how much the variable capital may fall in relation to the constant capital, so that the mass of surplus value, and hence profit which they appropriate grows, along with and despite the fall in the rate of profit. Capital Volume 3, Chapter 13, our emphasis. It should be noted that, in the previous sentence, Marx has explicitly referred to accumulation of capital, and thus expanded reproduction. This passage should be contrasted with the no less explicit one concerning economic growth under socialism. If however wages are reduced to their general basis, that portion of the product of his labor that goes into the worker's own individual consumption, if this share is freed from its capitalist limit and expanded to the scale of consumption that is both permitted by the existing social productivity, the social productivity of his own labor is genuinely social labor, and required for the full development of individuality. If surplus labor and surplus product are also reduced, to the degree needed under the given conditions of production, on the one hand to form an insurance and reserve fund, on the other hand for the steady expansion of reproduction in the degree determined by social need. If both wages and surplus value are stripped of their specifically capitalist character, then nothing of these forms remains, but simply those foundations of the forms that are common to all social modes of production. Volume 3, Chapter 50, our emphases. It is clear from these quotations that, for Marx, the difference in form implies a difference in quantities, especially in those dynamic quantities which are growth trends. Introduction. 39.3, around which so much academic criticism of Marx has revolved for almost a century, he constructs quite an imposing straw man out of this new contradiction. 39. In our opinion, however, his subtle distinction between Marx's two labor theories of value is based upon a simple conceptual confusion. For Marx, value and value production are eminently social qualities, referring to relations between men, and not physical attributes adhering to things once and for all. Thus, when Marx writes that the value of a commodity is the embodiment of human labor expended in its production, and when he goes on to say that its value is equal to the socially necessary labor contained within it, he is not making two different statements, but simply repeating the same thesis. For the value of a given commodity is determined only by that portion of labor spent in its production which corresponds to the social average, both the average productivity of labor and the average socially recognized need, that is to say, which is recognized by society as socially necessary labor. Labor expended in the production of a given commodity, but not recognized by society, is not productive of value for the owner of that commodity. However, precisely because value and the production of value refer ultimately to the distribution and redistribution of the total available labor power society engaged in production, that macroeconomic aggregate is a basic economic reality, a basic fact of life. If 5 million workers work 2,000 hours a year in material production, the total value product is 10 billion hours, independently of whether the socially recognized value of each individual commodity is equal to, or larger or smaller than, the actual number of labor hours expended in its production. It follows that if the value of a given commodity is less than the labor actually spent on its production, then there must be at least one other commodity whose value is greater than the quantity of labor actually embodied in it. 40 Social recognition of labor expenditure and 39. Michio Morishima, Marx's Economics, Cambridge, 1973, pp. 11-12. Cf. Grundrisse, Op. Cit. Page 135. What determines value is not the amount of labor time incorporated in products, but rather the amount of labor time necessary at a given moment. 40. Cf. Capita, Volume 3, Chapter 10, especially the following passage. Strictly speaking, in fact, the market value of the entire mass, as governed by the average values, is equal to the sum of its individual values. Those producing at the worst extreme then have to sell their commodities below their individual value, while those at the best extreme sell theirs above it. See also below, page 207. If the commodities are not sold at their values, then the sum of converted values remains unaffected. What is a plus for one side is a minus for the other. 40. Introduction. Actual labor expenditure can differ only for individual commodities, not for the total mass. 41. In that sense, Morishima is right when he stresses that, in the last analysis, and for the capitalist mode of production, as distinct from petty commodity production, Marx's law of value is fundamentally an aggregate, macroeconomic concept. 42. The nexus between the reproduction schemas and the problem of the circulation of capital in general, and the theory of value leads us back to one of the most hotly disputed issues of Marxist economic theory, the exact delimitation between productive and unproductive labor. As the schemas are value schemas, they express only value production, and automatically exclude economic activities which are not productive of value. What precisely are these activities? It has to be admitted that the solution of this problem was made more difficult by Marx himself. There are undeniable differences, if only of nuance, between, on the one hand, the long section of theories of surplus value dealing with the problem of productive and unproductive labor and, on the other, those key passages of Capital, especially Volume 2, which treat the same subject. One striking illustration of this is the analysis of commercial agents and travelers. They are classified as productive workers in the theories, and as unproductive workers in Capital Volumes 2 and 3. 43. In recent years, a long and often confused debate among Marxists has further complicated the matter. 44 is also 41. I shall come back to this thesis when I deal with the so-called transformation problem in the introduction to Volume 3. 42. Morishima, Op. Cit. pp. 2-3, 43. Theories of Surplus Value, Part 1, Moscow 1969, page 218. Capital Volume 3, Chapter 17, and see below, pp. 209-11. Even within Part 1 of Theories of Surplus Value, there are striking contradictions on this question. Thus on page 157 Marx writes, an actor, for example, or even a clown, according to this definition, is a productive laborer if he works in the service of a capitalist. And on page 172 he states, as for labors which are productive for their purchaser or employer himself. As for example the actor's labor for the theatrical entrepreneur, the fact that their purchaser cannot sell them to the public in the form of commodities but only in the form of the action itself would show that they are unproductive labors. 44. C. Infer alia, Jacques Nagels, Travail collectif et travail productif dans Evolution de la pensée marxiste, Brussels, 1974. S. H. Kuntz, Productive Labor and Effective Demand, London, 1965. Arnaud Berthet, Travail producti, et productivité du travail chez Marx, Paris, 1974. Ian Goff, Marx and Productive Labor, in New Left Review, number 76, November to December 1972. Peter Howell, once again on Productive and Unproductive Labor, in Revolutionary Communist, No 3/4, November 1975. Mario Kogoy, Were Theorie und Staatsausgaben, in Probleme einer Materie, Istischen Staatstheorie, Frankfurt, 1973, pp. 164-71. P. Bischoff et al. Productive und Unproductive Arbeit als Kategorien der Klassen. Introduction. 41. Intertwined with differences in judging the so-called service industries. Which, to take one example, are not included in Soviet and East European accounting as contributing to national income, on the basis of a particular interpretation of Marx's theory of productive labor. 45. How then shall we unravel the problem? A preliminary distinction which we need to draw goes to the heart of the matter. When Marx classifies certain forms of labor as productive and others as unproductive, he is not passing moral judgment or employing criteria of social, or human, usefulness. Nor does he even present this classification as an objective or a historical one. The object of his analysis is the capitalist mode of production, and he simply determines what is productive and what is unproductive for the functioning, the rationale of that system, and that system alone. In terms of social usefulness or need, a doctor provides labor which is indispensable for the survival of any human society. His labor is thus eminently useful. Nevertheless, it is unproductive labor from the point of view of the production or expansion of capital. By contrast, the production of dum-dum bullets, hard drugs or pornographic magazines is useless and harmful to the overall interests of human society. But as such commodities find ready customers, the surplus value embodied in them is realized, and capital is reproduced and expanded. The labor expended on them is thus productive labor. In the framework of this Saussure 1y determined and historically relative IZED concept, productive labor may then be defined as all labor which analyze, in Sozialistische Politik, June 1970, Altvater and Heusken, Produktive und Unproduktive Arbeit als Kampfbegriff, in Ibid. September 1970. Rudi Schmid, Zentralprobleme der Marxischen Ökonomie, Asians und Krisentheorie, Diploma Thesis, Frankfurt, 1972. I. Hashimoto, The Productive Nature of Service Labor, in the Kyoto University Economic Review, October 1966. Kei Nishikawa, Productive and Unproductive Labor from the Point of View of National Income, in Osaka City University Economic Review, Number 1, 1965. Kei Nishikawa, A Polemic on the Economic Character of Transport Labor, in Ibid. Number 2, 1966. See also the article by Elisabeth Okoga, Catherine Collett-Theleme, Pierre Salama and Hugues Lagrange in Critiques de l'économie politique, numbers 10 and 11/12, January to March and April to September 1973. Those by J. Morris and J. Blake in Science and Society, numbers 22, 1958, and 24, 1960, and those by Fine, Harrison, Goff, Howell and others in the Bulletin of the Conference of Socialist Economists, 1973-5. There are numerous books on Marxist economic theory which deal with the same subject in passing, 45. See, for example, Jean Marchal and Jacques Lecaillon, La répartition du revenu national, Les Modèles, Volume 3, Le Modèle classique. Le Modèle marxiste, Paris, 1958, pp. 82-5. Bronislaw Mink, Op. Cit. pp. 159-65, and many others. 42. Introduction is exchanged against capital and not against revenue, i.e. all labor which enriches one or several capitalists, enabling them to appropriate a portion of the total mass of surplus value produced by the total mass of value producing wage labor. 46. We could call it labor productive from the point of view of the individual capitalists. All wage labor engaged by capitalist enterprise, as opposed to labor functioning for private households for consumption needs, falls into that category. This is the level at which theories of surplus value stops. But when he returns to the same problem in Capital Volume 2, from the point of view of the capitalist mode of production in its totality, and especially from that of the growth or accumulation of capital, Marx now distinguishes labor productive for capital as a whole from labor productive for the individual capitalist. For capital as a whole, only that labor is productive which increases the total mass of surplus value. All wage labor which enables an individual capitalist to appropriate a fraction of the total mass of surplus value, without adding to that mass, may be productive for the commercial, financial or service sector capitalist whom it allows to participate in the general sharing of the cake. But from the point of view of capital as a whole it is unproductive, because it does not augment the total size of the cake. Only commodity production makes possible the creation of value and surplus value. Only within the realm of commodity production, then, is productive labor performed. No new surplus value can be added in the sphere of circulation and exchange, not to speak of the stock exchange or the bank counter. All that happens there is the redistribution or reapportionment of previously created surplus value. This point is made clear in Capital Volumes 2 and 3. 47. Most of the relevant passages from Volume 2 were drawn by Engels from manuscripts 2 and IV. In other words, they were written in 1870 or between 1867 and 1870, sometime after the theories of surplus value of 1861-3, and even after the rough manuscript of Volume 3, and may therefore be considered to express Marx's definitive views on the question. Contrary to what is said in the theories, they imply that wage-earning commercial clerks or travelers do not perform productive labor, at least not from the standpoint of capital as a whole. However, even when this basic principle is established, 4 additional problems remain to be solved. First, there is the question of so-called immaterial goods, concerts, circus acts, prostitution, teaching, etc. In Theories of Surplus Value, 46. See Theories of Surplus Value, Part 1, Op. Cit. Chapter 4, 3, 47. See below, pp. 209-11, and Capita, Volume 3, Chapters 16 and 17. Introduction 43. Marx tends to classify these as commodities, insofar as they are produced by wage earners for capitalist entrepreneurs. Although in Volume 2 he does not explicitly contradict this, he insists strongly and repeatedly on the correlation between use values embodied in commodities through a labor process which acts upon and transforms nature, and the production of value and surplus value. 48. Moreover, he provides a general formula which implies the exclusion of wage